I just want to find 11,780 votes.
The Fulton County Grand Jury investigation of Donald Trump.
What proves fact A, fact B, and fact C? If we can do that, I'm going to bring an indictment.
I'm Bill Rankin.
I'm Tamar Hallerman. Join us for Season 9 of Breakdown from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution.
Listen now, and please follow us on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
Today on CityCast Philly, we're taking some time off as the year wraps up, but we didn't want to leave you hanging. We're revisiting some of our favorite episodes of the year and handing out some well-deserved superlatives. We'll be back in the new year with fresh episodes. Our pick for the most thought-provoking story is the ethics of prison tourism. In October, I spoke to journalist Hope Corrigan about how former prisons like Philly's Eastern State Penitentiary have become tourist attractions, and what is the most ethical way to do that? It's Friday, December 30th, 2022. I'm Trenae Nuri, and this is CityCast Philly. Journalist Hope Corrigan, you recently wrote a piece for the Marshall Project, which is a nonprofit online organization that focuses on issues related to criminal justice. And your piece focuses on haunted prisons and the tourism industry that's connected to it. You talk about a place here in Philadelphia, Eastern State Penitentiary, which is a historic prison. Can you tell me a little bit about why you chose this location?
Sure. So I visited Eastern State Penitentiary to report this article, and it's a former prison turned museum in Philly. And every Halloween they would have an event called Terror Behind the Walls. And what struck me as interesting and why I visited and had a conversation with Sean Kelly, the director of curation there, is because they have recently changed their programming for this particular event. It used to have a haunted house with evil doctors, a jailbreak, zombie inmates, that type of thing.
Right. I remember also they had you could drop your car off at the parking lot and get picked up on this like really creepy trolley that had like a weird bus driver, zombie bus driver. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And so they've really changed that as they have much of their other programming to be more optical illusions, live performances. There's bars and food trucks. And it's highlighting the museum's mission of focusing more on mass incarceration and the history of incarceration in America in a respectful way, and less of this kind of spooky paranormal Halloween programming.
Now, like you said, Eastern State doesn't do the Terror Behind the Walls anymore. How did the change actually come about? Like, when did they start to have those conversations?
So in recent years is when it started changing, and Eastern State had added a really, really well done exhibit about mass incarceration. And I think that kind of sparked a conversation internally in the past 2 years of really looking at how they wanted to approach the topic and the conversation, and whether this Terror Behind the Walls event was appropriate given their other efforts to really spark a conversation about the injustices of mass incarceration. Okay. They ended the tour at Eastern State. There's a big exhibit about mass incarceration in the United States. And one of the questions it asks is, have you ever committed a crime? And it asks you to think about, using an illegal drug or shoplifting or minor things.
Yeah.
And it really drives home the point that a lot of people are just one mistake away from incarceration. And that's an important thing to consider when we think about these former prisons.
Interesting. So it sounds like Eastern State might be a place that some might say is setting a better example of how prison tourism can be thought of. But Hope, what made you look into this story initially?
So in Louisiana, there is an annual rodeo that happens at Louisiana State Penitentiary, also known as Angola. And it's an event that thousands of people come to every year from around the South. And essentially incarcerated men are, with no prior training, compete for the entertainment of these visitors in rodeo events. And that struck me as something that was really interesting, of how we've created this event that it seems a little bit exploitative, given that these men are paid for participation. And as we all know, money is very hard to come by when you're incarcerated. And so that got me thinking about other examples of tourism, of prison tourism. And is the Angola prison rodeo an outlier, or does this happen all over the country? And it also got me thinking, would this happen in other countries? Would something like a prison rodeo, be acceptable in other countries that don't have the same approach to incarceration and the dehumanization of people who are incarcerated in this country?
What other places around the country did you look into?
There's one in West Virginia Penitentiary, and visitors can sit in a defunct electric chair. There is an escape the pen, escape room style game where the governor issues a quote 1 hour stay of execution before you can escape the room. Missouri State Penitentiary encourages visitors to take photos in an old gas chamber that executed 40 inmates at one point in history. And the Texas Prison Museum sells, a thing of mints that says solitary confinement, which, is something that, given that solitary confinement is torture,
right.
It's a little questionable. And so these places are spread out around the country. And there's also other examples of this. For example, there is a former prison turned hotel in Boston that really plays up kind of a cutesy theme for their restaurant and hotel, where the bar is called the Clink. And so thinking about that, it's raised some questions in other places like Eastern State Penitentiary of what's appropriate and what's not.
By turning these places into sort of a spectacle or like a game, like you said, one of the prisons does, what kind of impact does that have?
Well, it raises a question about how we memorialize these places. And I had asked Sean Kelly, the director of Eastern State Penitentiary, if he thought we should be thinking about these former prisons like concentration camps or plantations, because they are places of suffering and family separation. And in the case of the death penalty of execution. And so it raises a question that I think a lot of people need to just reflect on personally. And also when you think about where you're bringing children for these events, a lot of these events are geared towards families. And so asking, is this the type of conversation we want to be having about mass incarceration and the history of the penal system in the U.S. With our kids or within our own family is important.
You said that these places are meant for families. I'm thinking children. Is there a certain age demographic that they're targeted to? Or because I'm not these are really heavy topics, and explaining solid confinements and mass incarceration to maybe elementary school students is pretty hard.
Absolutely. I mean, at West Virginia Penitentiary, I was looking on their TripAdvisor page when I was reporting this story, and there are photos of small children in the electric chair, the defunct electric chair that they have there. And they're smiling, posing for the picture. And I think that, there's no age targeting for this. It's family fun, and that's how it is advertised. And so, these are heavy topics. And I think that when we present these topics as fun, as spooky, as gamified to young children, it might send the wrong message to those children about incarceration and about the justice system in America.
So if people dressing as zombie prisoners, jumping out and scaring you could be viewed by some as not the way to go, how do businesses ethically repurpose these institutions?
That's a great question. And that's something that I think has yet to be answered. And there are different opinions about this, because some people would say, these old places should just be torn down and something else should be built there. And other people would say, well, it's history, so let's preserve it, but let's preserve it in a respectful way, as Eastern State is attempting to do. And then there are other people, who might see nothing wrong with it, who might say, these are places that held people who are quote unquote bad people. And so, it's not a problem.
Do you think we can learn something by touring these places?
Absolutely. And I think that it all hinges on the programming and the curation. And I think that we can learn a lot of important history about the United States and about also how far we haven't come when it comes to incarceration and the justice system, and how things are very similar in many ways to how they were in the early 1900s when these places were erected. And so I think it can be important to go and observe and, reflect on how these places have played a role in American history and where we are today with mass incarceration as well.
And I guess on the flip side, from a visitor's perspective, is there a way for people to visit these places, respect the history, learn without being exploitative?
I do, but I think it definitely requires visiting places that treat the topic with respect. And doing a little bit of research about what happened at that former prison. Did they execute people? Did they use solitary confinement? That type of thing I think is important to consider. And I think that doing a little bit of research about the programming and the tone is very important when you're thinking about visiting these places. And so, for example, Eastern State Penitentiary, they have a very well publicized exhibit, like I mentioned, about mass incarceration and the statistics behind it and how we compare to other countries around the world. And I think that is an excellent place to go and visit and learn and reflect on this topic.
You didn't cover this in your story for the Marshall Project, but there is a place in Pennsylvania called Pennhurst Asylum, which is in Spring City. It's about an hour away from Philadelphia. That place was a real state hospital in the early 1900s, and it was shut down after incidents of patient abuse and mistreatment was revealed. Now it hosts a haunted house every year that has actors. What do you think about that?
That's a great question. It's something I've been thinking about too, because I've seen more examples of this with former asylums and state hospitals. And I think it's in the same vein. I mean, I think that when we go to these places that were places of any sort of suffering, that, these patients at this hospital suffered abuse at the hands of the people that worked there. I don't know that is a place that we should be going for fun. I think that it's helpful for people to do a little bit of putting yourself in another person's shoes and thinking, if you had a family member who was confined to that asylum, would you be okay with people going there, drinking, having fun, taking photos? Would that be something that you're okay with? That answer may vary for different people, but it's just a question to ask oneself for any type of these places that are hosting these paranormal, spooky Halloween events.
Journalist Hope Corrigan, thank you so much for being here on CityCast Philly.
Thank you, Trinae.
We'll have a link to Hope's full story for the Marshall Project in our show notes. That's all for the year here on CityCast Philly. Thank you so much for spending time with us in 2022. We're so excited to bring you more stories about Philly in 2023. I gotta get used to that. If you've been enjoying the show, tell someone about it at the New Year's Eve party this weekend. And if you haven't already, definitely sign up for our morning newsletter. It's called Hey Philly. We'll be back on Tuesday, January 3rd, with our predictions and goals for 2023. Be safe this weekend and Happy New Year!